And we are live, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of The Rational Standard. My name is Martin van Staden. I am joined by David and Sarah. We're a bit on a bit of a skeleton crew today, given the long weekend and some technical issues from some of our other usual participants. But we have to keep the show on the road. And while today isn't a special day, it's the 2nd of May. Yesterday was, in fact, a special day. It was the 1st of May, also known as May Day and also known as Labor Day around the world. But to some of us here at the Free Market Foundation, we know it as the Victims of Communism Memorial Day. This is a notion coined, I think, by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. It's a Washington, D.C. based think tank. They celebrated in November, but Ilya Sonman of Professor Ilya Sonman of I think he's at George Mason University, and he writes for Reason magazine, a well-known classical liberal or libertarian American magazine, has been making the argument for many years now in Reason that in fact the 1st of May should be that day, and I think that makes sense. So a little bit different today. I quickly just want to introduce us to this topic because I think our august sages in South Africa's parliament have already celebrated what today means to them. We can see the parliamentary statement here that went out a few hours ago. Parliament joins millions of workers around the world in celebrating International Workers' Day today. 1st of May has been recognized as an international holiday since 1891 and was declared an official public holiday in South Africa following the attainment of freedom in 1994. So Parliament is very keen, but if you look into what International Workers' Day is, and I mean, we at the Free Market Foundation, we're very pro-worker, I would say. We at the Rational Standard, we often publish articles talking about the great injustices that are done to the millions of unemployed in South Africa. So we are very pro-work, very pro-worker. We are very keen on the common law that has many protections for workers' rights and so forth. So we have no issue with this concept. But International Workers' Day, the 1st of May, has for a very long time been associated not just with um, kind of labor and work. Great thing John Locke based his whole liberal philosophy ultimately, at least as far as property is concerned, in work, in taming nature through labor. Um, but this is not what this is. International Workers' Day has been associated with the international communist movement. The Second International held its inaugural meeting in Paris on that day in 1889. And you can go through the history. This is the day that many Marxist entities and labor unions specifically chose to have certain stayouts and strikes and so forth. This is very much a socialist day that celebrates what they would consider to be socialist gains. And my own journey into, you can call it the liberal movement, libertarianism, started in part with this essay by Alan Charles Course. It's called "Can There Be an After Socialism?" There will be a link to this, of course, to everyone who is interested, and I would recommend reading it. It's not terribly long; you'll get through it in 15 minutes. But this was one of the pieces that I read that unmade of me a progressive and made of me a classical liberal, because Coase really gets to the substance of what it is that free marketeers are doing in the post-socialist world, and really how we're failing. I'm going to highlight some things that he says. He wrote in 2003. He says, "We're now invited to discuss what follows from these tyrants, the bloodthirsty tyrants of communism of the previous century, and how the world looks after that." And he says there's one problem, however, the bodies. We're surrounded by slain innocents, and the scale is wholly new. It's not tens of thousands killed and this thing or the other thing. It's not even the 6 million dead from the horrible Jewish Holocaust that occurred in Germany, but in fact, scores of millions of bodies. In certain respects, 20 to 40 million in China in 3 years alone, not killed by firing squad, but in a very real sense, killed just by the consequence of ideology. People who have starved. In addition to the millions, of course, who died in gulags, who were killed by the regime. And these are perhaps the most important points, lines that he writes here. No cause ever in the history of all mankind has produced more cold-blooded tyrants, more slaughtered innocents, and more orphans than socialism with power. It surpassed exponentially all other systems of production in turning out the dead. Um, Very key point, very key point. And he gets into a little bit, because when we say this, people are always like, no, but capitalism has killed exponentially more people throughout history, and of course it gets to that eventually. And ultimately what he says is that when Nazism came to an end, when the Allies won the Second World War, there was a real reckoning. There was a real reckoning that continues rightly to this day, that some people kind of at universities maybe are forgetting with their anti-Semitic outbursts, but there was a real reckoning. The scholarship is massive. People committed suicide. Nazis at Nuremberg committed suicide in their cells. There was an international awakening about what National Socialism means, and that it is unacceptable. And while you can look at Romania, you can look at certain examples of communist tyrants being overthrown, you can look at Poland, which has great monuments that I saw myself to the end of communism in Warsaw. The scale of that reckoning in the days after communism has not been the same. And I mean, for us in South Africa, that is manifested most brutally, really, in the fact that we have politicians calling each other comrade, and they do it unironically. Someone in the chat is calling me Comrade van Staden, and I always enjoy it when we do that. But it's ironic. It's not sincere. But we have politicians, powerful politicians in this country, who call themselves comrade, call each other comrade, who celebrate socialism, who go to Cuba to celebrate with the incumbent communist regime there, various anniversaries of their so-called revolution. So this does not happen with Nazi parties, and these things still exist, but they are necessarily fringe. We have not had that, and what cause this is, we cannot have an after socialism like we do have an after Nazism today, until we have that same reckoning, until our history books teach what communism was in practice, like we do what Nazism was in practice, where we vilify this ideology and make it taboo to unironically call each other comrade. Uh, Corey says the dead lie among us ignored. Poland, for like I said, not so much, but around most of the world. And Corey says, especially in the West, due to a certain intellectual pathology, we pretend like the communist dead. It just never happened. There is no justice for the people that were killed by this ideology. You can think of movies like Schindler's List that very rightly, he says, our artists rightly obsessed on the lesser but still immeasurable Holocaust. But the same is not there for the greater communist Holocaust. There are, of course, exceptions. We've always seen a movie or two about what happens in Soviet gulags, but very rarely has this been linked very explicitly, like anti-Nazi art does, to the ideology, the toxic ideology that underlies that whole system of thought. And here, Corys gets into why this is. Um, uh, there's a pathology of Western intellectuals that has committed them to an adversarial relationship with free markets and individual rights. Here he gets into the rebuttal that's always thrown back at us. No, we can mourn the communist dead, but what about the capitalist dead? And what does he say? Um, he says, here it is. Free markets and individual rights has produced the greatest alleviation of suffering, the greatest liberation from want, ignorance, and superstition, and the greatest increase of bounty and opportunity in the history of all mankind. There was very clearly a before capitalism in human history and an after capitalism in human history. Before capitalism, there were two classes: the elite, the aristocracy, the nobility, and the poor. That's it. After capitalism, that completely changed. That completely changed because now, after the Industrial Revolution, the possibility, at the very least, of liberating yourself from poverty became something that is not just possible, but very plausible in systems of the rule of law and free markets. But because of the pathology that Cordes refers to, uh, we step around the Everest of bodies of the victims of communism without a tear, a scruple, a regret, an act of contrition, or a re-evaluation of self, soul, and mind. And Cordes was perhaps before his time now, the anti-woke kind of revolution that is occurring kind of in the West now. But what does he say here? In the midst of unparalleled social mobility in the West, they, being these pathological Western intellectuals, cry caste. In a society of munificent goods and services, they either cry poverty or consumerism. In a society of ever richer, more varied, more productive, more self defined, and more satisfying lives, they cry alienation. In a society that has liberated women, racial minorities, religious minorities, and gays and lesbians to an extent that no one could have dreamed possible just 50 years ago, they cry oppression. In a society of boundless private charity, they cry avarice. In a society in which hundreds of millions have been free riders upon the risk, knowledge, and capital of others, they cry exploitation. In the midst of this plenty, these plentiful welfare states, these rent-seeking welfare states, they still cry exploitation. In a society that broke on behalf of merit the seemingly eternal chains of station by birth, what I just referred to, they still cry injustice. In the names of fantasy worlds and mystical perfections, they have closed themselves to the Western liberal miracle of individual rights, individual responsibility, merit, and human satisfaction. So this is often said that Marxism, the practice of Marxism, is always compared to what Marxism is in theory, but the failures of capitalism is always compared to what capitalism is in practice, never the theory. So there's this incongruence between how these two things are evaluated. And like I said, I think this is highly recommended reading, especially now, May Day, the Workers' Month being May in South Africa, to just take a step back and ask ourselves, is this something that we should rightly be celebrating? Of course, we should be celebrating workers. But given the ideological context of what this means, we wouldn't celebrate anything similar if it had any kind of roots in Nazism. If we had a Day of Nations that celebrates ethnic diversity, and we discovered that this is something that Hitler inaugurated, we would never celebrate that. So is it fine for us to be celebrating something like this, especially while there is no justice for the victims of communism? So I have given a long enough introduction here. I think that kind of gives us a context, David. If you have any thoughts to take us further here.
Well, thanks, Martin, for taking us through that essay. I think it's really good to revisit some of these texts that inspired our political awakening, so to speak, that made us woke. But, and I think getting back to those first principles, I mean, ultimately, I think socialism hasn't had that reckoning. So even though the capitalist West or the Western liberal democratic system seemingly triumphed with the fall of the Berlin Wall, I don't think there's really been that deep investigation, just like that author says, about the human toll and the suffering that occurred under the Soviet Union and other communist countries. About 8 years ago or so now, I visited Cambodia, and the remnants, the horrors of the Khmer Rouge are still evident there. And I visited some of the places around the killing fields, and there was one particular venue which was quite harrowing, which was an old school that was used for mass executions. And I remember being taken to a tree, a very beautiful tree in the courtyard, and there were all these ribbons and bangles attached to the tree. And so I asked the tour guide, "Oh, what do these mean?" And he said, "Oh, well, each one of these represents a child that was killed in this very spot." And he then went on to explain, I don't want to get censored on YouTube, but how the children would be literally have their heads smashed against the tree in order to kill them. And then, it was adults who were also killed there. And bear in mind that out of a population of about 7 or 8 million people at the time, the Khmer Rouge was responsible for the deaths of approximately 2 million people. So over a quarter of the entire population. And really the whole guiding philosophy there was that they needed to completely eliminate the middle classes. So you had anybody who wore spectacles like you and I, we would be victims. Our soft hands that are used for typing and not tilling the fields would also be a sign of our class standing. And so, yeah, it was basically a class genocide. And you had taxi drivers who were actually doctors who didn't want to be discovered. They destroyed the entire central bank, blew it up in an attempt to get to this year zero. And you could see money kind of, this was in the 1970s, kind of littering the streets. And this was basically an attempt to completely socialize the entire society and have a great leveling. But the human cost was astonishing. And, I think that essay really points out to some of the paradox of, we rightly condemn the Holocaust and the horrors of that. We're familiar with the mass deaths of World War II and World War One, but somehow that critical gaze seems to not fall on a lot of these communist regimes. And yeah, I just remember also very vividly being escorted to this structure that had been built, a monument to the death and suffering that had occurred under the Khmer Rouge. And it was this very high structure. It was about 2 or 3 stories high, and it was entirely filled with human bones. And yeah, it's a very morbid scene, but it really powerfully underscores the horrors of what occurred there. And so I think you mentioned Poland. I think that's one of the few countries that has actually had this very staunch reckoning with communism. Maybe a lot of the Baltic states as well had a kind of a strong reflex against that. And, just putting on our policy hats again, these are also countries that are doing fantastically well in terms of economic freedom, economic growth, free enterprise. These are leading dynamic economies. And a country like Poland for most of the 20th century was a backwater. And it's always been sandwiched between these 2 great powers of Germany and Russia, but is now a flourishing society. And, there's a lot to be learned from these places. So, yeah, I think we need more monuments to the untold suffering that occurred during these communist regimes. We need to remember the deaths of those in Cuba under Castro's regime, and Maduro and Chavez's Venezuela. And yeah, so I think very interesting in a way in Russia. Perhaps this is a nationalist impulse, but Joseph Stalin seems to be still widely venerated in Russia, which even though you wouldn't call Russia today a socialist state, it's kind of seems to be an extreme nationalist kind of system over there. But yeah, I think we need to learn those lessons, those hard truths. And in my office at Northwoods, I have a book which is quite an intimidating book, the Black Book of Communism, which basically catalogs a lot of the death and suffering. We haven't even really spoken about China and the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution there, which basically destroyed that society as well. So, yeah, it's I think an appropriate way to commemorate Workers' Day, to reflect on the suffering of many millions of people.
Yeah, and I guess the saddest part of this is that it's carrying on. So one of the great things about the Second World War was that it brought Nazism to a kind of a decisive conclusion. So you had you could say kind of quasi-Nazi regimes in some areas in the Balkans. There were sympathetic political leaders in South America and India even. But the end of that war just meant, listen, any designs you had on establishing a Nazi state, that's done. There's no place for fascism. Uh, well, yeah, I think certain aspects of fascism kind of won the day and are all around us today, but there's no place for this brand of National Socialism in the world. And yet, here we sit in 2025. Communism supposedly came to an end with the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's kind of how people express that idea sometimes. Um, but of course, that is not what happened. The Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire fell with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that has, as you said, David, led to the liberation of the Baltics, much of Eastern Europe, certainly Poland, and those are thriving, wonderfully successful societies today. Even Ukraine, by comparison, where the Holodomor occurred under the Soviet occupation, which killed tens of millions at least, that society became comparatively thriving after the fall of communism. But yet we have communist states today, and I so Vietnam is formerly a communist state, China is formerly a communist state, and they are relatively free market economies. And I think it's better to be nominally communist and free market than to be nominally capitalist and communist. So I won't judge them too harshly for that, but it does go to show that this is still possible. That decisive no didn't come in 1998 and in 1989. If these regimes still feel comfortable leaning into this identity, this communist identity. I mean, in South Africa, we have memorials for communists. And it's one thing to condemn the apartheid government for extrajudicial killings, which of course they must be condemned for, and to condemn assassinations. But to celebrate communists, I mean, there is something just inherently sick about that. To pretend like these people um, who died maybe unfortunately before they could come to their Damascus moment to say, "My God, I really was misled," and I like Corey also says in his essay, we must allow room for these people to do a mea culpa, to say they were wrong without malice. And maybe some of these people were killed before they had that opportunity, but then you don't celebrate them because they went to their graves espousing this ideology of death and destruction, and they're celebrated despite that, and there's something just wrong with that, and that it's normalized in our society. And I think it's more so normalized in our society, which I would say is it's a Western society. South African society is largely a Western society, and I don't think you will find another Western society, with potentially the exception of Russia, where this type of veneration for dead communists is normal. The rest of the West hasn't had the reckoning with communism that it should have had, but it's still quite rare to find these celebrations of tyrants. You won't find that in Romania, for instance. You won't find that in the Baltic states, and even for many in Russia, even right after Stalin passed away, there was amongst the communists kind of an understanding that, geez, this guy maybe took it a little bit too far, and thinking fondly back to the Stalinist era is also taboo to some degree, but not in South Africa. In South Africa, we think longingly that a communist state was not established in the 1990s. We have people actively saying now that the compromise on what is a kind of imperfect mixed market economy was unacceptable, and that in fact complete and utter nationalization of property should have occurred in the 1990s. And people say this without consequence. I don't favor censorship, so there should be no legal consequences for them saying that. But I do think there should be significant social, cultural, even potentially economic consequences for people seen to be defending this ideology. And I
Yeah.
find that to be the kind of the sad thing, is that we ended Nazism decisively, and even after communism, there's still this lingering presence around us.
Yeah. I mean, just an anecdote. I was at a wedding a couple of years ago, and I was sitting next to a young woman who works as an associate at a corporate law firm, and we were talking about policy, our view of the world, and so on. And she said, "Yeah, I must confess that I'm a closet socialist." And I immediately said to her, "Well, if I was a socialist, I'd also be embarrassed about it, and I'd also try and hide it from people." And for some reason, in polite society, it's okay to say this. I mean, if she had announced to the dinner table at the reception that she was a closet Nazi, then I think people would have been rather horrified. um, but and I think it is important in our social interactions to actually call out these kind of arguments, and you can do it in a polite way. You don't have to you don't have to get all hysterical about it. But I think a lot of people conflate this idea of compassion for the poor and a discomfort with the current way of things. You mentioned that term, Martin, an imperfect mixed market economy, and they see poverty and suffering, and they say, "Well, I want to alleviate poverty, so therefore I must be a socialist." And you need to really strongly push back against that, I think, to say that ultimately socialism is about coercion, and that liberty should be the default, and any infringements on liberty should be very strongly justified, rather than the other way around. This was Robert Nozick's argument that usually it's people make the argument that liberties need to be justified at the expense of some kind of exercise of state power, but it's actually power that needs to be justified, rather than the freedoms are inherent. And yeah, I think there are multiple ways of dealing with it. I mean, all of the horrors that we just described, like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, was a concerted campaign of targeted killing against a particular group of people. But also from a policy perspective, even if you don't have malevolent intentions, the outcomes are still disastrous. The Great Leap Forward, I think, is a really good example. The fallacy that you can centrally plan an entire sophisticated economy is just it's just nonsense. And there you had peasants basically, in order to industrialize the country, they were told to put down their plows and instead focus their energies on industrial production. And often what resulted from that was that peasants neglected their fields, and they were melting down their pots and pans and their door handles in crude furnaces in their backyards. And what they produced obviously wasn't particularly high quality steel or any manufactured goods. And what resulted was that whole harvests went neglected, and wide scale famine was the result. And people ended up utterly starving. There were instances of cannibalism, people boiling their leather shoes in order to make a broth out of that and drinking that, eating the bark off of trees. Whole populations of birds were completely eliminated. That's another fallacy of this kind of socialism versus capitalism debate, that people automatically assume that capitalism is bad for the environment, but actually socialism can be far more ruinous. You only have to think of is it the Caspian Sea, or was it another large lake in the Soviet Union that completely disappeared because it was overdrawn. So yeah, I think there's kind of two arguments really at play. There's what's an effective public policy strategy, and then there's also the moral argument, which I think is more powerful, which is that actually you need to basically respect the rights and freedoms of individuals first, rather than coercing them to some outcome that you're trying to socially engineer your entire society towards.
Yeah, I think you touched on something crucial there. The moral and maybe not to kind of detract from its importance, the emotional kind of appeal is what the socialists got right, and that is perhaps part of the reason why the reckoning against the so-called imperfections of capitalism is overwhelming, but against the very evident problems of socialism is virtually zero, given is the emotional appeal. And I think of um, Leonard Trelawney Hobhouse, brother of Emily Hobhouse. He wrote in 1911. He wrote a book called Liberalism, um, and this was now, let's say, the kind of the peak just before the First World War. The First World War, which was a very important event in the history of liberalism, specifically, where he wrote essentially. Yes, there was poverty, unknown kind of omnipresent poverty in society until the Industrial Revolution, and he was an Englishman, so in England, and that fundamentally changed everything. And now the notion of prosperity is accessible to the society, and this is on the back of classical liberalism. What do you go is the old liberalism, and he admits this completely. He doesn't reject the factual basis of that, but ultimately, at some point in that very short and very insightful book, he says, "But yeah, it's not enough. The fact that there is now plenty, and not everyone shares in the plenty, is a problem. And as a result, we must reinvent liberalism, capitalism, to incorporate more." And he says this very kind of explicitly with reference to the work of John Stuart Mill, someone who is incorrectly remembered as a liberal. He says that we must incorporate socialistic ideas into the old liberalism to make it more just, so that everyone can share in this plenty. And John Gray, the historian of liberalism, identifies L.T. Hobhouse as the one of the big turning points between the um, dominance of the classical liberal worldview in the West that that went up until the First World War, and the beginning of what is now known as progressivism or social democracy, which is pink socialism basically rather than red socialism, but which is, I think, this pathology of Western intellectuals that Cordes referred to. It is this class of people you would see as kind of smart, polite society, um, who just will not take on socialism because of that emotional appeal, that very strong aspect of compassion, that appeal to compassion that is inherent in the socialist value proposition, even though it has nothing to do with the facts. And the issue that we as classical liberals and libertarians have, and I must say it is a problem. Many people would say, it's not a problem. It's good. It's a good thing. Is our preoccupation with facts and data and numbers and reality to some degree. We are preoccupied with objective, observable reality at the expense of this emotional appeal, at the expense of the cultural battle that from Gramsci, the socialists have pulled off in magnificent fashion, kind of their march through the institutions, capturing media, capturing the press. Pravda 24 in
Yeah.
South Africa is a good example. We have the socialists won that battle, but we almost stubbornly refuse to do that, because when there's a chance to take that step, we're like, no, but the data, the facts, the reality, and of
Mm.
course understanding reality is very important, but
But
we don't have the
feelings don't
balance
care
right.
about your facts.
Exactly, exactly,
Yeah.
and we don't have the balance right, and that's why the free market is seen as this cold thing, and you alluded to this, and I spoke about this in the context of what Corey said. The free market, despite being this massive liberation tool for the poor, is seen as a cold and disinterested phenomenon, whereas the caring state, the caring socialist state, is seen as this warm father figure and sometimes mother figure, which in fact kills you. If you're not part of the party elite, you're dead,
Mm.
and that's our fault. That's very much our fault as liberals and libertarians and free marketeers, as conservatives even, um, for not making that, for not bridging that gap. And I guess even though we sit here as think tankers and people who run a publication, um, we do need that media and cultural in march through the institutions. Basically, we need our Gramsci that goes beyond just the policy aspect, so that we can create these compelling stories about why freedom, why production, why free enterprise are in fact good moral things. And I think any of us can think of good stories to tell: the underdog coming up against the state, or the Ayn Rand, I guess, tried this with some of her work. I didn't think it really took. There's Ayn Rand over my shoulder there. But to tell the story of why being a captain of industry is a good thing, why you are contributing massively to your society rather than being this parasite that you're portrayed as. So we need to bridge that gap, and I don't think we're making a lot of progress in that respect.
Yeah, I think the cultural terrain, I think, is something that is very important, and I think the policy discussion obviously is necessary, but happens almost downstream from culture. I think Gramsci and other cultural Marxists really understood that, and that if you can imbue your value system within the very DNA of an institution, it's very easy to subvert that institution, and we've seen that with in so many spaces like education, higher education institutions in South Africa, for example, in the wake of the Fawless movement. Those institutions have been irrevocably changed, I would say, by that movement. So yeah, I mean, I think I've read a lot about the history of communism and the horrors of these socialist systems, but still, the text that looms large in my mind is George Orwell's Animal Farm, right? I mean, I think that's just a perfect exposition of how power corrupts. And yeah, George Orwell is my favorite socialist. He I think, really understood how power can change people and how also corrupting it is. But yeah, so I think, if I think one of the points in the essay, in the cause essay, is that we also need more examples of art, cultural artifacts that actually capture some of the perils of socialism. I think he mentions the Gulag Archipelago and One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, both by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But actually, one of the films which I think really captures the cold, destructive power of living under socialism is The Lives of Others, which is a German film about the kind of the later years of East Germany, and it tells the story of a playwright who is kind of commissioned to write a piece. He's kind of a well-known playwright in East Germany, in East Berlin, and at some point falls foul of the authorities. And the story also follows a spy who I think we lost Martin, which meant that we lost me. So yeah, and so I'll conclude the story. Hopefully, Comrade van Staden joins us again. But yeah, it follows also this spy who's eavesdropping on this playwright, and he's initially a very staunch apparatchik of the state, but through his observations of this couple, who he's spying on, the playwright and his partner, he sort of comes to terms with what he is doing and how he is part of this machinery of the state that is oppressing people and stifling their freedom. And the spoiler alert of the film kind of ends with the Berlin Wall falling, and he kind of immediately removes his headpiece and all his spy gear, and he just kind of walks out of the spy office kind of to freedom. So yeah, that's one of my favorite films, and yeah, really worth a watch. I think it's quite underrated. And then yeah, Goodbye Lenin as well is also quite more of an amusing satirical look at the fall of communism. And yeah, that's also another German film worth watching. What cultural artifacts do you think really capture some of these like books and films?
Geez, that's a tough one. I mean, for me, it's always been a lot more implicit, and it's too implicit, really, for me to really link it to socialism. Um, Kind of when I watch movies about the horrors of Nazism, given kind of my own ideological predispositions, I immediately see that as a warning against the horrors of socialism as well. If you think of kind of, the Zone of Interest is a very good recent movie about the Holocaust, but it just kind of shows the industrial approach to killing human beings that the Nazis observed. And from what I understand about the Soviet Union, it was exactly the same. There is no kind of distinction other than it wasn't necessarily done on ethnic grounds, but these were still human beings who were being kind of killed, and their individuality essentially was completely disregarded, their dignity as people. But kind of other media that I always find to be good for this, and it works for me. It certainly doesn't work for other people. Is the relatively new genre of cautionary tales about superheroes. You think of Amazon's The Boys. You think of also Amazon's Invincible. And essentially, it tells the story of society going completely gaga over these supermen, these people who are there to protect us, and investing in them complete and utter public confidence, and showing, unlike Marvel and DC Comics, which portray Superman as this kind of well-meaning kind of protector of humanity, and all the other heroes as well, that shows that actually your superheroes are still people. They still have their own perversions. They still have their own kind of ambitions in life, and they have power. They have power that you do not have. And what I get from that is that this is a cautionary tale against statism. What like these the Politburo, this revolutionary vanguard that the workers have chosen somehow to push for their interests in society, they're still people. They are people with their own perversions and their own ambitions, things that they want to achieve in society. But unlike you, they have power. They have real tangible power that they will and do use against you. So for me, superhero fiction, especially this is a new genre, relatively speaking. There are no just pure superheroes. Even in The Boys, even the good guys, the good superheroes, are imperfect human beings who abuse their power. And I think that's good. I think that story needs to be told, but it doesn't make that explicit link to socialism. I mean, I've watched. I think it was a movie a few years ago, The Long Walk. It is a bunch of prisoners from a gulag escaping and having to walk through Siberia into Mongolia, but it never makes that explicit link with socialism. And even the movie you just described, I saw a trailer for it the other day, and I actually have it bookmarked. It's something that I really desperately want to watch. But that also applies in the context of, for instance, the American surveillance state, I would say, to some degree at least. And it's not necessarily socialism. And I think that and it's tough. It's very tough. I mean, it's easy for with communism, with Nazism, I would say, because we've seen it done. We've watched movies like Conspiracy, which is about the Onesie conference. Very entertaining, very good. But that is very much an analysis of the ideological issues with Nazism. There was a mini series several years ago about Hitler from Hitler's perspective. It's the man, and it kind of shows his thinking. Why is he doing what he's doing? I can't remember the name of the series. Very good, and it exposes the ideological problems with what is happening, and our fiction isn't telling that yet. Maybe there's good books on that. I'm regrettably not a good fiction reader, but as far as kind of visual and audio media go, the cautionary tale is very much still has been general about statism, about Nazism, but not yet about compassionate socialism. So that's maybe Daily Wire, which is now broken into the cultural space, is going to come up with some solutions there. I don't know of anyone else really occupying that space right now. So I'm very interested in what they could achieve.
Yeah, in a similar vein to the kind of fallen superheroes is Watchmen, the comic book series, which I think is very dark and similar kind of cautionary tale about the abuse of power. I think it's another phrase that I like, which is power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. And I think we all have that potential within us. As Solzhenitsyn reminded us that the line between good and evil runs through the hearts of every man. And that, I think, underpins a lot of our philosophy as well, is that actually, even the best intentioned, the wisest among us, the most benevolent, are prone to mistakes, abuses of power. And that's why we want to put fetters and restraints on people's power. Even the most enlightened of us are prone to these kind of abuses. And I think we were in previous streams talking about the COVID pandemic and how very quickly that vast amount of power that was acquired by the state led to real human consequences. I mean, you only have to ask the family of Collins Causa, who was killed at the hands of the security forces just for drinking a beer in his backyard. So, this is not just something that happens in communist China or the Soviet Union. It can happen to every society. And I think very important to keep your eyes open and be aware of the push for communist ideals here in South Africa through the National Democratic Revolution. It's very explicit in the policy program of the ANC. You only have to look at their policy documents from every time they have a policy an elective conference, they resolve all manner of socialist undertakings. So I think we need to call that out and push back against it very vociferously.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it's one of the consequences of this loss in the cultural battle, because people feel quite uncomfortable calling these things out because they're couched in the terminology of good intentions. I mean, this week I published another rejoinder to Anton Harber on race law, and it's it's like history is just repeating itself incessantly on a weekly basis, with the people on Harber's side of the of the discourse still making this submission that the policies that the ANC has implemented and what they want to implement, and I mean we see this around the EWC Act as well. They are good intentions, and look, it's about land reform or it's about redress, and how could you oppose these things? It's about inclusion, whereas the Nazis and apartheid was about exclusion. And this is just taken as an article of faith. It's like, well, they say it is, and it's couched in those terms, and therefore it must be so. And maybe we've just underestimated sheer power of language, in that maybe that is all it takes to convince people is just to lie. Because that is effectively what is happening. BE, for instance, is couched in the best. You can't find any issue with what it says it wants to do. We want more black people to become kind of wealthy industrialists. Of course, who could be opposed to that? But that declaration, and Professor Koos Malan writes quite a bit about this in his book, There Is No Supreme Constitution, where he writes that for many people in society, and maybe to some degree this does make sense. Maybe this is how humanity has adapted to the phenomenon of law, but to just say something in a piece of legislation or in an act of parliament gives that those words they're real, like it's a real thing in these people's minds because the law says so. It is so. And yeah, that shows the power of language and just saying that you want to do good. And funny enough, while you would find that people like Hendrik Verwoerd and so on did couch their project of separate development in good intentions in their speeches, if you read the acts, it's not there. So unlike modern day acts of parliament that say, "Oh, we want to achieve transformation and we want to promote inclusion and inclusiveness," uh, apartheid acts didn't say that, and maybe that's all it would have taken to nullify to some degree the anti-apartheid struggle, was literally for them just to say, well, this act is for a good thing, which would have obviously been very bizarre. But that is in the article. What I kind of say to Anton Harper is to say, if I have to accept your logic now, then the whole basis for the anti-apartheid struggle must evaporate, because you are preoccupied with what people are saying they want to do, rather than what is actually the result of that ideology in practice.
Yeah,
And
as Thomas
well,
Sowell once said, you should judge a policy by its outcomes, not by its intentions.
exactly. Yeah, and we don't. We as a society we do not. um, because I mean, look, if you think about Nazi Germany, the policy intention was to wipe out the Jews. That was the intention, very much so. And the policy intentions of socialism, of communist, of Stalinist Russia, was not to wipe out anyone out. It was to create abundance for the masses, and therefore it is judged as such, which is obviously a problem. I see someone asked the question in the chat whether the old NP government was socialist. A few years ago, I would have just said yes, of course. But I do think that we need to be a little bit careful with terminology. When people say socialist today, what they mean is derivative from Marxism. And to answer the question in that context, no, it certainly, the old MP government was not socialist. It was not Marxist in any way, shape, or form. It was an anti-Bolshevik, anti-Marxist institution. But the more broader meaning of socialism, you could, where it's kind of its policy must not reflect individual desires and interests, but must reflect the desires and interests of society. Sure, of
Collective.
course. Yeah, it was collectivist, and there were certain, you could say, communist features of apartheid. They nationalized phosphorus, phosphor. You had all the various state-owned enterprises that effectively nationalized those industries. ISCOR, the Iron and Steel Corporation. Those are kind
ESCOM.
of, yeah, ESCOM, of course, nationalized all
Transnet.
electricity. Yeah, so there were certain features, but you would find that in other places around the liberal capitalist West as well. I mean, today in the United States, and every time I think about this, I'm like, I can't believe it. But they still, in various states, the only legal wholesaler and seller of alcohol is the state. I mean, I can't believe that that is actually a thing that happens in the United States of America. But in various states, if you want to buy alcohol, you go to a liquor store. That liquor store is owned by the state government. That is
Do you think that
insane.
is that a hangover from the prohibition and the lifting of the prohibition in the
Yes,
30s?
yeah, you still have dry counties and wet counties in certain states as well that kind of prohibit that don't sell alcohol. I mean, I think you can buy a beer in drive it into the county, but you can't buy it there because the only seller of alcohol in the state is the state, and that county has no liquor stores. So I mean that is bizarre, but the United States is not a socialist state. Let's be clear about that.
Mm.
Even though you have these little features, and I mentioned earlier that I almost misspoke to say that fascism was defeated. No, well, fascism hasn't been defeated. Fascism, really, at its core, is the idea that you shouldn't have classes, economic classes in society of kind of the workers and labor and capital, the labor, capital, and state. These must all come together in one unified institution, which is the state, and that is where it must represent the kind of general will, and that is what
Mm.
fascism was to Mussolini, and to maybe to a lesser extent in Germany. But that principle certainly applies in South Africa today with institutions like NEDLAC. Every time the government talks about a policy, it says, we consulted business and labor, and we all kind of are putting out this unified statement. So fascism in that sense was not defeated. But yeah, I think
Yeah.
the thinking about the ideologies that govern us, we have to be careful and nuanced. The NP was not outright Marxist communist, but it was by no means a free market capitalist institution, except at the very end. It became
Mm.
kind of the Reagan Thatcher era, and then even after that, the National Party very much came around to free market capitalism, but too little, too late, ultimately.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think also the social engineering was, also one of those socialist features. Moving people around, violating private property rights. Black South Africans experienced that, and then, yeah, I think on their relationship with the market complicated. So, in some respects, despite a high degree of indignation towards English speaking and kind of Anglo and Jewish capital. There was a lot of friction and bad blood there, but they were also allowed to to pursue their commercial interests, and the mines sort of were a pole of power independent from the state. And all of the associated industries that grew out of the mining industry, the manufacturers, and even the press, which was linked to the mining houses. Yeah, so I think there definitely were socialist features, but I would agree with Martin. It wasn't, their antipathy towards Bolshevism, I think, was quite explicit. But yeah, I just want to remind our audience that Martin is very principled in his commitment to freedom, because even though he's a teetotaler, he's still indignant about the fact that the state controls liquor distribution in the United States. So yeah, he's a man of strong principles.
Yeah, and I'm also, I guess, one of the few people who actually write for our press very regularly about smoking. I've never smoked a cigarette in my life, and I never plan to. But currently in South Africa, I mean, Business Day ran one of my articles this past week. Currently in South Africa, the tobacco bill is kind of nearing adoption into law, and this is the thing that could see you going to prison for smoking inside your own house if you ever use the place as a place of employment. So yeah, I mean, for me, the key thing, and Leon Lowe always made this point very clearly, is that it is a matter in terms of lifestyle choice. Of first they came for the smokers, first they came for the drinkers, and I have many freedoms that I very much cherish, and I know that they will be next on the chopping block if I kind of stay silent in when people doing things that I don't like, when that is taken away from them. And I mean, this also very much applies to free expression. I think that's kind of the quintessential area of where this principle applies. And many people say it, but they don't actually mean it. This thing about I don't agree with what you say, but I'll die for your right to say it. We have this thing with Pravda 24 in South Africa now, where the fourth estate has exposed some random civilian's identity and kind of shown his address. They have a little pinpoint on his where he lives in the Western Cape, kind of on the biggest news site in the country. And what was his great crime? Yeah, He said some, I guess, racially dubious things, things that I would never say, things that I certainly disagree with in very strong terms. But those are kind of the spices that Pravda 24 added. Their actual issue was him exposing kind of Julius Malema singing Kill the Boer and nothing happening, and saying that bad things are in fact happening in South Africa, and Elon Musk picking up on this Twitter account. And that offended Pravda 24 quite a bit. So they do not believe in this principle, that they do not agree with what this guy is saying, but they, as the fourth estate, primarily the fourth estate, should be saying, we will die for your right to say it. That is really, the press is one of the institutions that are meant to be kind of the great protectors of freedom of expression in society. And we don't have that in South Africa. And that's kind of why it falls to people like you and me, David, and the Free Market Foundation and Rational Standard, hopefully to create some level of critical mass to turn that around.
Yeah, and freedom needs defending. I need to go shortly, but I also think it's appropriate, in addition to the millions of victims of communism, on Workers' Day, we should also remember all of those unemployed people, non-workers, as Ryan Kutsia pointed out on Twitter. We have about 8 million people who are effectively locked out of the labor market in South Africa, people who are able-bodied, who have a desire to work, but through regulatory restrictions are effectively prevented from exercising their right to work. And that includes the National Minimum Wage, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Labor Relations Act. And really what we have in South Africa is a labor aristocracy, those people who are fortunate enough to have a job, who lobby the government for special protections. And that has a number of negative consequences, including declining productivity, less incentive to perform. That means that employers find it difficult to fire delinquent workers, and then that makes them much more risk averse from taking a leap of faith on a young person who might have something to offer, but the employer is scared to make an employment offer because who knows how things might turn out, and then they're going to be stuck in the labor court for months trying to get rid of this person. So they just end up kind of doing the work themselves. So I think we also need to dismantle the labor aristocracy in South Africa, and it kind of goes back to that point that you made earlier, Martin, about corporatism, that you have kind of big business, organized labor, and government coming together to forge these social compacts, which are done in the name of social cohesion and unity and dialogue and consensus. But actually, there's a very narrow, specific set of interests that are represented by those groups. And there's this invisible group of people who are not at the table, who are eking out a living, depending on other people, living in a backyard shack maybe, who most of them would otherwise want to work, but cannot do so because of a lack of opportunities and also government restrictions on their right to work. So spare a thought for those people who would like to be workers, but who are not able to do so.
Yeah, and on that note, we might need to rethink Workers' Day as maybe a day to commemorate the non-workers, the unemployed, because that is a quickly growing group of people. The way we measure kind of unemployment in South Africa is somewhat problematic. It's normal, but it is problematic because if you stop trying to find work in this non-work environment, you are no longer considered unemployed. So always just bear that in mind whenever Stats SA publishes their unemployment statistics, and they say that there's been a 50,000 person reduction in unemployment. At least many of those would be people who are now simply, they've accepted their unemployment and now are no longer seeking work, rather than being people who found work. So on Workers' Day, on 1st of May, during Workers' Month, let's celebrate the people who are building this country through their hard work, but let's also spare a thought for those who desperately want to work and can't because of policy. And I've said it before, and I'm very committed to this statement, that unemployment in South Africa is a policy phenomenon. There are economic forces that we can't control, and there's international kind of forces that we can't control, but those are exponentially worse in the midst of the policy breaks that we have on creating work in this country. And on that note, I think we're going to call it a day there. With just two of us, it's difficult to make it to the hour-and-a-half mark. So usually when we don't have a full lineup, we'll have slightly shorter episodes, but we've done a good hour and 5 minutes. And yeah, I would just want to encourage everyone to like this video, share, crucially subscribe. We're on Substack, rationalstandard.com. Please restack this post as well, and like it on Substack as well. And yeah, David, if you have any last words.
Well, look, we're always experimenting, iterating with this platform. So it'll be cool to know from our audience what they think of the length of the episode. Are they happy with the hour and a half? Is an hour a bit more digestible? We'd like to use this platform to kind of have a bit of space to ventilate our ideas. So it's deliberately long form. But yeah, and then any other suggestions, please do let us know in the comments, technical stuff, and well, yeah, let us know what you think of some of the ideas we shared here today as well.
Yeah, thanks, David. And on that note, we are coming out of a long weekend, everyone. I hope you're going to make use of the last few days of freedom from work, I guess. Enjoy it. And we will catch you again next week, Friday. Same time, same place. Cheerio.
Bye.